Hello and welcome back. In today's video, we're going to take a closer look at the story of two best friends from Russia who set out on a long drive home along one of the most remote and unforgiving highways in the world, the Kolyma Highway, also known as the Road of Bones. What began as a simple plan to pick up a car and return home quickly turned into something far more serious. This story is a reminder that taking the shortest route isn't always the safest, and that in places like this, one wrong turn can carry heavy consequences. This is their story. In Russia's Far East, deep within the Sakha Republic, there's a stretch of highway that winds through some of the most isolated and unforgiving landscapes on Earth. Known officially as the Kolyma Highway, this gravel road spans nearly 2,000 kilometers, connecting the city of Yakutsk with the distant port of Magadan on the Sea of Okhotsk. But many people don't refer to it by its formal name. Locally and internationally, it's infamously known as the Road of Bones. The nickname comes from its grim history. During the 1930s under Stalin's regime, the Soviet government launched massive infrastructure projects across Siberia, aiming to open up mineral-rich territories in the east. To do this, they relied heavily on forced labor. Hundreds of thousands of political prisoners were sent to labor camps scattered across the region and ordered to build roads, including what would become the Kolyma Highway. Working in extreme cold with inadequate food, shelter, and tools, many didn't survive. Estimates vary, but some suggest more than 250,000 prisoners died during the construction of the highway. Beyond its history, the region itself is also defined by its climate. The Sakha Republic is one of the coldest inhabited places on Earth. In 1933, Oymyakon district, located along the older stretch of the highway, recorded a temperature of minus 67 degrees Celsius or minus 89 degrees Fahrenheit. Only Antarctica and Greenland have recorded colder temperatures. Even today, winter temperatures in the area regularly fall below minus 40. And summer offers only modest relief, rarely climbing past 20 degrees Celsius. Local residents are well aware of this reality. It's common knowledge that winter travel should never be done alone. Most drivers travel in pairs, each vehicle capable of supporting the other in case of a breakdown. If one fails, the second becomes a lifeline. To attempt the trip alone, especially during deep winter, it's considered not only unwise, but potentially fatal. Adding to the risks, a section of the highway was abandoned in the 1970s. Though some parts remain accessible, the route was no longer maintained and began falling into disrepair. Today, it's rarely used except by a few locals familiar with the terrain. For outsiders, especially during winter, it's a path best avoided. In 2008, the highway was officially upgraded to federal status, which brought better maintenance and year-round monitoring. But much of it remains unpaved, and many remote sections are still vulnerable to harsh conditions. As part of this federal overhaul, a new route was introduced that loops north through Usnera before reconnecting to the main road toward Magadan. It's longer but considered safer and more stable, especially during colder months. This new route bypassed a portion of the original road that passed directly through the towns of Kubime and Tomtor before continuing onto Kadichchan. Although not officially closed, this old section saw far less traffic after the new route opened. Locals still refer to it as the true Road of Bones, not just for its historical significance, but also because it's considered more dangerous than the newer alternative. It's this older road, largely untouched since 2008, that still holds a reputation as being unforgiving, especially when winter sets in. Sergei Ustinov and Vladislav Istinim were both 18 years old and had been close friends since high school. Growing up in the quiet coastal town of Ola, located in the Magadan region, the two had just begun the next chapter of their lives, each preparing for their respective careers. Sergei had recently started studying to become a geological exploration engineer, a field that held real value in the mineral-rich areas surrounding Magadan. Vlad, who had always had a passion for cars, was training to become a mechanic. While they shared a strong friendship, their personalities were quite different. Vlad leaned toward a more outgoing, image-conscious lifestyle, while Sergei tended to keep things low-key and preferred a quieter routine. In September of 2020, Vlad, accompanied by another friend, flew to Vladivostok to pick up a used Toyota Chaser he had recently purchased. Although he didn't yet have a driver's license, Vlad was already familiar with driving, and he brought along a friend who could legally handle the long trip home. Their plan was ambitious: drive the car from Vladivostok all the way back to Ola, a journey of nearly 4,900 kilometers that would take several days to complete. However, partway through the trip, the car broke down in Yakutsk, still about 3,000 kilometers from their destination. Rather than wait for the repairs, they decided to leave the car at a shop in the city and fly back to Ola, planning to return for it later once the work was complete. By late November, the vehicle was finally ready for pickup, and Vlad was eager to return to Yakutsk. His original companion, however, didn't want to risk missing school, so he declined the offer to go back. That's when Vlad asked Sergei to come with him instead. Sergei didn't know how to drive and didn't hold a license, but he agreed to make the trip anyway. When Sergei's mother, Galina, learned of their plan, she voiced her concern right away. As locals who were familiar with the region and its winters, she expected her son to understand just how dangerous that kind of drive could be, especially with the cold season already setting in. Sergei knew she wouldn't support the idea, so he chose not to tell her the truth. On November 25th, he told her he would be staying the night with Vlad to meet up with some girls, but that was just a cover. He and Vlad had already purchased tickets and would soon be boarding a flight to Yakutsk. The following day after they landed, Sergei texted his mother, revealing that they were already in the city. And surprisingly, she was shocked. In Magadan, the weather had recently hovered around -8 degrees Celsius, which had led the boys to wear only moderately warm clothing. Vlad wore a lighter winter jacket and pants designed for mild conditions, while Sergei was dressed in sweatpants, a cap, and a thin jacket. They didn't anticipate the colder temperatures in Yakutsk, where it had already dropped to -21 degrees Celsius by the time they arrived. Still, they weren't too concerned, figuring they would spend the majority of the journey into the car with a heater on. Since neither of them had ever driven from Yakutsk to Magadan before, they relied entirely on Google Maps for directions. The app offered two route options. One was the newer highway constructed in 2008, the other was a more direct path, a 470-kilometer section of the old Kolyma Highway that had largely fallen out of use since the newer road opened. Though technically still accessible, this older route which passed through small settlements like Tomtor and Kubime. For those familiar with the area, taking that road in winter was considered extremely risky. Despite the warnings that many in the region would be aware of, Sergei and Vlad chose the older road, likely trying to save time and reach home as quickly as possible. Shortly after leaving Yakutsk, Sergei took a screenshot of their GPS location and sent it to his mother. On November 27, he called her to check in, but due to poor signal strength, the call cut out before he could say where they were. That would be the last time Galina heard his voice. Over the next 2 days, Galina made repeated attempts to reach her son, calling multiple times throughout the day, but she received no response. Finally, on November 30th, she called 112, the Russian emergency number, and officially reported Sergei and Vlad as missing. She also phoned her daughter Yulia, Sergei's older sister, who at first thought there must be some mistake. Sergei had always been the type to keep his family informed, especially when traveling. It didn't seem like something he would do without good reason. On December 1st, a local investigator visited Yulia to ask questions about her brother and his friend. Around the same time, Vlad's grandfather, with whom he had been living, also contacted authorities after discovering that the money he had been saving was gone and his grandson was missing. Investigators initially suggested that the boys were probably off enjoying themselves, traveling, perhaps partying, maybe just being teenagers. But Galina and Yulia quickly dismissed that idea. Sergei didn't act on impulse and wasn't the type to disappear for days without explanation. Yulia began posting on social media, hoping someone along the route might have seen them. A truck driver responded to one of her posts, suggesting that she contact residents in the villages along the old highway and mentioned a road that had been largely abandoned after the new route was completed. Yulia shared this information with investigators, but it was brushed aside. In the village of Tomtor, people had already begun to hear rumors of two missing boys. Still, no one believed that anyone unfamiliar with the area would intentionally choose the old route, especially this time of the year when snow could quickly make the road impassable. Meanwhile, the Oymyakon District Police received a missing person report, 3 full days after the last known contact. Because the region was entering the polar night period, daylight was limited. Even by early afternoon, it was dark, making visibility a serious challenge. The white Toyota Chaser would have been difficult to spot against the snow-covered surroundings. By this point, the roadside stops and cafes along the highway were also asked if they had seen the pair, but none had. Frustrated with the lack of progress, Yulia decided to investigate herself. She called the gas station near Kubime, which sits near the fork between the old and new highways. The worker there recommended that she contact Tomtor directly. Some local taxi drivers, he said, had seen the boys pass through. When this was relayed to the police, a local officer in the Tomtor was asked to follow up, though he remained skeptical. The road conditions in the area were notoriously poor during the winter, and it seemed unlikely anyone would take that route. Finally, on December 3rd, police received data from the cellular network identifying the last ping location of the boy's phone and was in the tower in Tomtor. This was the first concrete lead. The local officer began questioning taxi drivers and hotel owners around the town, but initially found no useful information. He then visited the only gas station in Tomtor. At first, the station refused to release the footage, citing paperwork issues. But after securing the necessary approvals, the officer returned and reviewed the tapes. The footage showed the white Toyota Chaser pulling in and the boys getting out to refuel. They stayed for about 10 minutes. Afterwards, they tried to stop at a bakery but found it closed. They then appeared to drive back in the direction they had come from. The officer sighed in relief and assumed they had reconsidered and were returning to the safer highway. But something felt off, so he kept watching the footage. Roughly 30 minutes later, the car reappeared on camera, this time heading once again into the direction of the old road, past the village and over an aging bridge. He watched the screen for hours afterwards, but the car never appeared again. The police officer in Tomtor had never driven beyond the old wooden bridge that crossed the Indigirka River. That part of the road, considered nearly impassable during winter, was unfamiliar to him. Given the conditions and the uncertainty ahead, he contacted 2 local men who knew the area well and asked them to accompany him. With daylight limited and temperatures dangerously low, they prepared to follow the old dirt road, hoping for any sign of the 2 missing teens. Every few kilometers, the group stopped the vehicle and walked around, checking the sides of the road for any indication of a crash or a stranded car. Occasionally, they came across tire tracks, but most seemed far too large to belong to a sedan like the Toyota Chaser. It had now been 6 days since Sergei and Vlad had last made contact. The old wooden bridge they had crossed earlier technically wasn't open. A concrete block had been placed at the entrance with a faded sign indicating closure. But the barrier didn't physically prevent vehicles from crossing. That was the only way forward along the old highway, and clearly someone had driven over it recently. It was early in the morning when they finally saw it, a white car, barely visible under a thin blanket of snow, pulled to the side of the road. From a distance, it looked like it had been there for some time. As they approached, they saw the engine wasn't running, and the windows were slightly frosted from the inside. When they opened the door and shone a light into the car, they found Vlad, still alive but barely. He was slumped in the front seat and muttered weakly for help. Behind him, wedged between the front and back seats, was Sergei's motionless body. When one of the men reached over to touch him, they immediately realized he was already frozen. His skin was stiff and his limbs had gone cold, and there was no sign of life. There was no way to move Sergei's body at that moment. It was frozen in place, and the focus had to be on getting Vlad to safety. He was in a fragile state, severely frostbitten, and barely conscious. They carried him to their vehicle as quickly as they could, carefully covering him with whatever layers they had, and left Sergei's body in the car. Just days before the rescue, the temperatures in the region around Tomtor had dropped below minus 50 degrees Celsius. When the two friends were traveling through the area, their car had hit a large piece of wood that was partially embedded in the frozen ground. The impact had severely damaged the radiator, leaving the vehicle unable to start. Without heat and with no nearby towns or traffic, their situation quickly turned from bad to worse. At first, they considered walking back toward the last village they passed, but with the nearest settlement kilometers away and the temperature dropping fast, they realized it wasn't an option. Instead, they tried to stay warm using whatever they had. They burned a spare tire, gathered branches from the surrounding woods, and tried to build a fire, but it was difficult. The bitter cold made it nearly impossible to sustain a flame for long. Even removing other tires to feed the fire proved too difficult in the freezing temperatures. When their small fire finally went out, they climbed back into the car hoping someone would come looking for them. For the next several days, they endured the brutal cold inside the vehicle, trapped in the coldest permanently inhabited place on Earth. Without proper winter clothing and no way to start the car, their bodies slowly shut down. Sergei eventually died of hypothermia. As they drove back toward Tomtor with Vlad in the back seat, the rescuers did everything they could to keep him awake. They asked him simple questions about his family, his favorite hobbies, even why he had chosen to buy a Toyota Chaser, anything to keep his mind active. They avoided bringing up Sergei, knowing the emotional toll that might take. All Vlad said during the entire trip back about Sergei was that he was his best friend. When they finally reached the village, the officer called ahead to the clinic and informed the doctor on duty of what had happened. Immediately, gathered a small team of 3 other medical staff and rushed to the building to prepare. The clinic was small and lacked the kind of equipment needed for a severe medical emergency, but they did what they could. One nurse gave Vlad hot fluids, while another checked his vital signs. A third injected his limbs with Novocaine to help reduce pain and prevent shock, though its effects were limited and temporary. Recognizing the need for stronger treatment options, the doctor sent another officer to gather 10 bottles of vodka from around the village, partly for disinfection, partly to help keep Vlad's body temperature from dropping further. Despite the urgency, the doctor ruled out an airlift to Yakutsk due to the extreme cold, which could jeopardize a helicopter flight. Instead, an ambulance was arranged to transport him by road, and they began the long 7-hour drive to Usnera through the snowy terrain. 2 days later, authorities returned to the site where the car had been found and recovered Sergei's body. Once Vlad arrived at the hospital in Usnera, he refused to speak to anyone about what had happened. He only asked when Sergei would be brought into the same room and placed beside him. Medical staff didn't respond to his questions about his friend. In his condition, they didn't want him to burden him with the truth right away. Eventually, Vlad was transferred by air to Yakutsk for further treatment. The damage to his extremities had been too severe. Both of his hands and legs below the knee were amputated due to the extent of the frostbite. He remained in the hospital for several months as he slowly recovered from the physical and emotional trauma. In the weeks that followed, Sergei's sister Yulia took legal action against Google, filing a lawsuit that argued the company bore some responsibility for directing the boys into an abandoned and hazardous section of the old Kolyma Highway. The case also sparked wider criticism of local authorities, with many questioning why it took so long for officials to respond and why the family's concerns had initially been dismissed. Sergei's mother later expressed frustration, saying that if the missing teens had been the children of someone with influence, they likely would have been found much sooner and might still be alive. In the aftermath of the tragedy, Google quietly removed the outdated route from its mapping service to prevent others from being led down the same dangerous path. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day and I'll see you in the next video.